When a group of officers burns Sheriff Martin Harper's car, unaware he's their boss, it sets off a chain of events that force a town to confront its own deep-seated biases. As Martin fights for justice, the truth slowly unravels, revealing not just the actions of a few, but the prejudice of an entire system. Will Martin's quiet resolve bring about real change, or will the town's resistance bury the truth once again? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Sheriff Martin Harper was no stranger to late nights. After taking over as sheriff in the small, tight-knit town just months earlier, he had learned that his role extended well beyond enforcing the law. It meant understanding the community's needs and listening to its unspoken fears. Tonight, after a community meeting had stretched into the late hours, Martin felt a sense of responsibility to drive through a part of town often associated with petty crimes and neglected grievances. The dim, flickering streetlights and the eerie quietness were stark reminders of the challenges he faced as one of the few black sheriffs in a predominantly white community. As Martin navigated the back roads, his mind wandered back to the meeting he'd just attended. The discussions had been heated, touching on police accountability and public safety. Martin had listened carefully, acknowledging concerns while also advocating for the broader changes needed within the department. His words had been met with nods of approval from some, but with skepticism from others. Despite the mixed reactions, Martin knew his approach was as necessary for meaningful change. Suddenly, the wailing of sirens broke the silence, and red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Instinctively, Martin slowed his car, pulling over to the side of the road. His heart rate remained steady. This was not the first time he'd been pulled over, even as a law enforcement officer. He knew the drill all too well, but tonight he felt a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that this encounter might be different. Within moments, 3 officers approached his vehicle. Officer Donovan, the first to reach the driver's side, had a stern, almost aggressive expression on his face. "License and registration?" he demanded curtly, his hand resting on his holster. Martin complied calmly, handing over his identification without hesitation. "Sir, I'm the sheriff," Martin stated simply, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it escalated any further. Donovan barely glanced at Martin's ID before passing it to Officer Harris, who was younger and seemed more hesitant. Officer Cole, the third officer, stood behind the others, watching intently but saying nothing. Despite Martin's attempts to explain his identity and reason for being in the area, Donovan remained skeptical. His eyes narrowed as he scanned Martin's face, seeming to search for any sign of deceit. "You're out here pretty late, aren't you?" Donovan asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Martin remained calm, though he could feel a simmering frustration beneath his composed exterior. "I'm returning from a community meeting, checking on the neighborhood as part of my routine." Donovan seemed unfazed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Realizing that any resistance could be misinterpreted, Martin complied, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. As he stepped out, he noticed Harris and Cole exchanging uncertain glances, as if questioning the necessity of the escalation. Yet they followed Donovan's lead. "Do you mind if we search the car?" Donovan asked, though it was more of a declaration than a question. "I have nothing to hide," Martin replied evenly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He knew that revealing his authority too forcefully could provoke a backlash, but staying silent could also perpetuate the injustice he was experiencing firsthand. The officers began the search, rummaging through Martin's belongings with an invasive thoroughness. Minutes turned into an excruciatingly long wait. As Martin stood by the roadside, he felt not just the chill of the night air, but the familiar sting of being doubted and disrespected. This was not merely about him as an individual. It was about the broader issues he'd vowed to address from the day he assumed his role. Donovan's search yielded nothing incriminating, yet he seemed unwilling to back down. His frustration was evident, his pride visibly bruised by the lack of results. Martin's calmness, a quiet defiance, only seemed to fuel Donovan's anger. Then, in a shocking twist, Donovan turned to Harris and Cole. "Let's teach him a lesson," he muttered. Maybe this will keep others from coming around here." "What do you mean?" Harris asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. But Donovan was already pulling out a small lighter, signaling his intent. "We'll burn the car. Send a message." Harris hesitated, but Donovan's authority seemed to paralyze him. Cole, equally unsure, remained silent. Martin's pulse quickened, not out of fear for his car, but for what the moment represented. He stepped forward, a firm yet composed expression on his face. "This is not how justice is served," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. But Donovan's resolve was unshaken. With a flick of the lighter, he ignited a rag, throwing it into the open window of Martin's car. Flames quickly engulfed the vehicle, the crackling sound filling the night as smoke rose into the dark sky. Martin watched, his expression a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. This was not just an attack on his personal property, but a symbol of deeper systemic prejudice. Finally, as the flames cast eerie shadows across the scene, Martin turned to the officers, his voice calm but authoritative. "I am Sheriff Martin Harper," he declared, holding up his badge for all to see. "You've just committed an act of arson against your own sheriff." The officers stood in stunned silence, their faces pale under the harsh glow of the fire. Donovan stammered, attempting to explain, but the damage was already done. Harris and Cole looked mortified, their expressions a mix of guilt and disbelief. Martin's eyes remained fixed on the burning car, his mind grappling with the irony and injustice of the moment. He felt a surge of determination, a realization that this incident, though deeply personal, could be the catalyst for the change he had always envisioned. He knew this was just the beginning of a longer battle, one that would test not only his resolve, but also the very soul of the community he served. As the flames of Martin's burning car subsided, a strange silence fell over the scene. The three officers stood frozen, their expressions shifting from disbelief to panic. Officer Donovan, the instigator, was the first to react. He looked around nervously, his tough demeanor faltering in the face of what had just transpired. Officer Harris and Officer Cole remained silent, their initial confidence replaced with a palpable sense of dread. "You're really the sheriff?" Harris asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Martin's response was calm but carried the weight of his authority. "Yes, I am. And what you've done here tonight is not just a mistake, it's a crime." The gravity of the situation was sinking in for the officers, particularly Harris, whose face was marked by a growing regret. Donovan, however, seemed more concerned with salvaging his pride than acknowledging his wrongdoing. "We thought," he started, but Martin cut him off. "You thought I was just another black man passing through, and that made it okay to treat me this way?" Martin's words were sharp, his voice firm. The officers tried to justify their actions, citing the rise in recent crimes in the area and claiming they were only trying to protect the community. Martin listened, his expression impassive, but inside he felt a mixture of frustration and determination. This was not just about him. It was about the broader issue of racial profiling that he had fought against throughout his career. Martin decided not to press charges immediately. Instead, he chose to follow the proper channels, allowing the legal process to take its course. His decision was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a show of strength, a testament to his commitment to justice, while others questioned why he would allow the officers to walk away that night. Back at home, the atmosphere was heavy. Gabrielle, his wife, was furious. She had always supported Martin's career, understanding the challenges he faced as one of the few black sheriffs in the region. But seeing him humiliated in this way was more than she could bear. "You should have arrested them on the spot," she insisted, her eyes burning with anger. "What kind of message does this send?" Martin remained calm, though the hurt in Gabrielle's voice stung him deeply. "I want this to be more than just an arrest, Gabby," he explained. "I want it to be a lesson, a catalyst for change. If I react out of anger, it becomes just another statistic." Jordan, their 17-year-old son, had been listening from the hallway. He stepped into the living room, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. "Dad, I don't get it," he said quietly. "Why didn't you do more? Why didn't you stand up for yourself right then and there?" Martin took a deep breath, understanding the disappointment in his son's eyes. "Sometimes, Jordan, the strongest response is not the loudest one," he said. I want to change the system, not just punish a few bad actors. It's a longer fight, but it's the only one that brings real change. Jordan didn't seem convinced. He shook his head and retreated to his room, leaving Martin and Gabrielle in tense silence. Gabrielle finally spoke, her voice softer now but still edged with worry. I just want to make sure this doesn't break you, Martin. Or worse, our family. The story quickly became the talk of the town. Local news outlets were soon flooded with reports of the incident, sparking outrage and intense debate. Some residents were appalled, expressing their support for Martin and demanding accountability from the police department. Others, however, were skeptical, suggesting that Martin might have exaggerated the incident to push his own agenda. These rumors hurt Martin deeply, but he remained focused on the bigger picture. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. The officers involved in the incident faced immediate suspension, pending an internal investigation. Donovan, unrepentant, still maintained that his actions were justified. I was just doing my job, he insisted during the preliminary questioning. I didn't know he was the sheriff. Harris, on the other hand, was starting to show cracks in his tough exterior. The realization of what he had done was weighing heavily on him. I never meant for it to go this far, he admitted to a colleague during a break. I was just following orders, but now I can't stop thinking about it. What if it were me or my brother in that situation? Meanwhile, Martin found himself in a new role, not just as the sheriff, but as a symbol of resistance and reform. He received messages of support from neighboring communities, civil rights organizations, and even fellow officers who were appalled by what had happened. Despite the public attention, Martin remained committed to addressing the issue within the town itself. He initiated a series of community meetings where residents could voice their concerns and share their experiences. At the first meeting, Martin stood in front of a diverse crowd, his voice steady as he spoke about the incident. What happened to me was a personal injustice, he began. But it's not just about me. It's about a system that needs to change, not just here, but across the country. We need to build trust, and that starts with accountability and empathy. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Martin. His words resonated deeply, touching on the pain, anger, and hope that had been brewing within the community for years. Residents took turns speaking, some sharing their own experiences of bias and discrimination, while others expressed gratitude for Martin's courage in pursuing change. One elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. I've lived in this town for over 60 years, she said, and I've seen good officers and bad ones. But tonight, I see a sheriff who is willing to confront the truth, even when it's painful. That's the kind of leader we need. Martin felt a surge of emotion at her words, a validation of the path he had chosen. The meeting ended on a note of cautious optimism, with commitments from both the community and the police department to work toward meaningful reform. In the days that followed, the investigation's official findings were released. Donovan was dismissed from the force, a decision that sent shockwaves through the town. Harris received a suspension and was ordered to undergo bias training, while Cole, feeling unworthy of the badge, chose to resign voluntarily. Martin felt a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. The outcomes were just, but they were not victories in the traditional sense. They were necessary steps in a longer journey toward justice and reconciliation. That evening, as Martin returned home, he found Jordan waiting for him on the porch. You did it, Dad, Jordan said, his voice filled with admiration. You made a difference. Martin smiled, feeling a sense of relief and pride. It's not over yet, Jordan, he replied, but we've taken a big step forward. The two stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky. It was a moment of peace amidst the chaos, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a glimmer of hope. As the investigation concluded, the town began to adjust to the aftermath of its findings. Donovan's dismissal from the police force sent ripples through the community. It was a stark message that accountability was no longer optional, even for those who had long operated with impunity. For many residents, this was seen as a victory for justice, a sign that change was possible. Yet for others, it was a moment of reckoning that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own beliefs and biases. Martin, although satisfied with the results, remained focused on the broader mission of reforming the department and healing the community. He had never sought to make the incident about himself, but he recognized its potential to drive systemic change. Donovan, the ringleader of the night's events, remained defiant. He clung to his justification, insisting that his actions were necessary to maintain order. His stance was unwavering, and his defensiveness only fueled the anger of those who demanded accountability. One afternoon, Donovan sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the television. News segments continued to play clips of the burning car, overlaid with sound bites of Martin's calm but firm statements about systemic prejudice. Donovan's jaw clenched, his pride deeply wounded. He had always believed he was upholding the law, but now he found himself at odds with both the community and his own department. Yet he was unwilling to confront the possibility that his assumptions and biases had driven his actions. Harris, in contrast, was struggling with profound regret. He had spent sleepless nights replaying the scene in his mind, the moment when he had followed Donovan's orders without question, the flicker of fear in Martin's eyes, and the realization of who Martin was. Harris had joined the police force to protect people, but now he felt as though he had betrayed that very principle. Unable to suppress his remorse any longer, Harris decided to reach out to Martin. He chose a quiet afternoon, waiting until most of the office had cleared out before approaching Martin's office. He knocked hesitantly on the door. "Sheriff Harper," Harris began awkwardly, standing stiffly at the threshold. Martin looked up from his desk, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Come in, Officer Harris," he said calmly. As Harris took a seat, his eyes were downcast, his voice shaky. "Sir, I wanted to apologize. I know what happened that night was wrong, and I was part of it. I don't know how to make it right, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." Martin studied Harris's face, seeing the genuine remorse etched there. He knew this was a difficult step for the young officer. "I appreciate you coming forward, Harris," Martin said evenly. "But words alone aren't enough. Change has to come from within you and within this department." Harris nodded, tears of frustration welling up in his eyes. "I know, sir. I want to be better. I don't want to be the kind of officer who makes decisions based on fear or prejudice." Martin's gaze softened slightly. "Then start by being honest, not just with me, but with yourself. Acknowledge your biases and work to overcome them. This is not just about one incident. It's about how we approach our roles as officers and as human beings." Meanwhile, Officer Cole found himself caught between conflicting emotions. He had never intended for the situation to escalate the way it did, but his silence that night had made him complicit. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and he knew that his career and his integrity were on the line. Cole struggled to find a way to make amends. He avoided social gatherings and kept a low profile, haunted by the look in Martin's eyes as he watched his car burn. Cole's wife, Jessica, noticed the change in him. "What's really going on?" she asked one evening, her tone both curious and concerned. Cole hesitated before responding, unsure of how to explain the complexity of his feelings. "I messed up, Jess. I let something terrible happen, and now I have to live with that." Jessica placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not defined by one mistake, Matt. But you have to do what's right now, even if it's hard." Encouraged by his wife's words, Cole decided to testify truthfully during the investigation, hoping it would bring some measure of redemption. It was not an easy decision, as it meant going against Donovan and potentially facing backlash from others within the department. But Cole was tired of the silence. He was ready to confront the truth, no matter the cost. As the investigation progressed, more details of the officer's past conduct surfaced. Complaints that had previously been dismissed were now being re-examined. It became clear that the incident with Martin was not an isolated case, but part of a larger pattern of racial bias within the department. Martin used this opportunity to advocate for systemic reform, pushing for better training, clearer accountability measures, and a community-centered approach to policing. In the midst of these developments, Martin continued to host community meetings, fostering open dialogue between residents and law enforcement. At one of these meetings, a middle-aged man named Frank stood up to speak. His voice trembled slightly as he shared a personal story of being stopped and searched under similar circumstances years earlier. I never reported it, Frank admitted, because I didn't think anyone would listen. But seeing Sheriff Harper here, speaking out and taking action, gives me hope. The room was silent, filled with a mix of emotions, sympathy, anger, and a desire for change. Martin nodded in acknowledgement, deeply moved by Frank's words. "This is why we're here," Martin said. "To listen, to learn, and to make sure that what happened to Frank, to me, and to countless others doesn't happen again." The investigation continued to unravel not only the events of that fateful night, but also the deeper issues within the town's police department. Martin remained at the center of it all, navigating a delicate balance between personal pain and professional duty. He knew that true change would not come easily, but he was determined to see it through. One evening, as Martin returned home, he found Gabrielle sitting on the porch, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You're making a difference, Martin," she said quietly, "but don't forget to take care of yourself too." Martin smiled, grateful for her unwavering support. "I won't, Gabby," he promised, "but I can't stop now. There's too much at stake." As the days turned into weeks, the investigation reached a critical juncture. Harris's remorse, Cole's testimony, and Donovan's refusal to accept responsibility all became pivotal elements in the case. The town was forced to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about its police force, but also about the biases that had long been part of its fabric. Martin remained resolute, knowing that the path to justice was not a straight line. But with each step forward, he felt a growing sense of hope. A hope that the community, despite its flaws, could change for the better. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, and the atmosphere in the town was charged with anticipation. People debated not just the details of that fateful night, but also the broader issues of bias and accountability that had come to the surface. Martin had become a focal point of the conversation, both as a victim of injustice and as a leader advocating for change. He was determined to transform this moment of crisis into an opportunity for healing and growth. At the police station, tensions were at their peak. Officers who had once stood in silent complicity were now forced to confront their own roles within a flawed system. Some were supportive of the changes Martin was proposing, while others felt a deep resentment, believing that the scrutiny was unfair. Among the latter group was Officer Donovan, whose anger had only grown since the incident. One morning, Martin received a call from Donovan's attorney, requesting a private meeting. The request surprised Martin, but he agreed, hoping that it might signal some willingness on Donovan's part to take responsibility. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small conference room at a local mediation center. When Martin arrived, he found Donovan already there, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. "Sheriff Harper," Donovan began curtly, nodding but avoiding eye contact. "Officer Donovan," Martin responded calmly, taking a seat across from him. There was a moment of heavy silence before Donovan finally spoke. "I want you to know that I didn't mean for things to go that far," he said, his voice low. "I thought I was doing what was necessary to maintain order." Martin listened carefully, his face unreadable. "What you did wasn't about maintaining order. It was about assumptions, about seeing me as a threat rather than a person." Donovan's jaw tightened, but he couldn't deny the truth in Martin's words. "Maybe I made a mistake," he admitted reluctantly. "But I'm not a bad cop. I've served this town for years." Martin's gaze softened slightly, sensing Donovan's struggle. "I believe that people can change, Officer Donovan. But change starts with accountability. You can't undo what you did, but you can choose to be honest about it." Donovan's face reddened, a mix of shame and frustration. "I don't know how to fix this," he confessed, his voice cracking for the first time. "I've never been on this side of the line before." Martin leaned forward, his voice steady. "The first step is acknowledging the harm. It's not easy, but it's necessary. You have to be willing to confront your biases, not just as an officer, but as a person." Donovan nodded slowly, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. It was a small step, but it was progress. Martin knew that real change would take time, but this moment of honesty was a start. While Donovan wrestled with his conscience, Officer Harris was making his own journey toward redemption. The investigation had prompted Harris to engage in introspection, forcing him to question not only his role in the incident, but also the biases that had influenced his behavior over the years. Harris started attending community forums, sitting quietly in the back as he listened to residents share their experiences with law enforcement. These stories were painful to hear, but they were also necessary. One evening, Harris approached Martin after a particularly emotional forum. His face was drawn, his eyes reflecting a mix of guilt and determination. "I've heard a lot of stories tonight, Sheriff," Harris said, "and I see now that this isn't just about one incident. It's about how we as officers approach our jobs. I want to be part of the change." Martin felt a surge of hope. "It's not an easy path, Harris," he replied. "But it's the right one. You can make a difference, not just for yourself, but for the people you serve." As Harris walked away, Martin felt a sense of cautious optimism. There were still many battles to fight, but seeing an officer like Harris begin to understand the impact of his actions was a step forward. Officer Cole, meanwhile, faced a different kind of confrontation. His decision to testify against Donovan had isolated him within the department. Some of his colleagues viewed him as a traitor, while others were inspired by his courage. Cole struggled with the consequences of his choice, but he remained resolute. He knew that telling the truth was the only way to begin making amends. During a private conversation with Martin, Cole expressed his fears. "I never imagined I'd be standing on the other side of the line, testifying against my own partner," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I couldn't stay silent any longer." Martin nodded, understanding the weight of Cole's decision. "It takes courage to speak up, especially when it goes against the code of silence," he said. "You did the right thing, Cole." The investigation reached its climax at a public town hall meeting. The hall was packed, with residents eager to hear the findings and to voice their own concerns. Martin stood at the front, flanked by community leaders and representatives from the police department. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that it would be a defining one for the town's future. As Martin addressed the crowd, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me was personal, but it's not just about me," he said. "It's about how we treat one another and what we're willing to accept as normal." The room was filled with a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, and a sense of urgency. Residents took turns sharing their own stories of prejudice and profiling, some of which were eerily similar to Martin's experience. For many, it was the first time they had spoken openly about their encounters with law enforcement. For Martin, it was a reminder of the systemic issues he had vowed to address, not just as a sheriff, but as a member of the community. Back at home, the strain on Martin's family continued to grow. Gabrielle was supportive but exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Jordan, still grappling with his own sense of vulnerability, became more withdrawn. He struggled with the realization that even his father, a respected authority figure, was not immune to the biases that he himself feared as a young black man. One night, as Martin sat alone in his office, he heard a knock on the door. It was Jordan, his face hesitant but determined. "Dad," he said, "I still don't understand everything, but I'm proud of you. I just want you to be safe." Martin's eyes softened and he reached out to hug his son. "I want us all to be safe, Jordan, and that's why I'm doing this." As the investigation moved forward, Martin prepared himself for the challenges ahead. He knew that confronting the truth would be painful, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire community. But he also knew that it was necessary. The incident was more than a personal betrayal. It was a chance to hold up a mirror to the town, forcing it to confront its own prejudices. The days ahead would be difficult, filled with tense conversations and hard choices, but Martin remained steadfast, driven by a simple belief that change was possible, even in the face of deep-rooted bias. He was determined to see this fight through, not just for himself, but for those who had been silenced for too long. The investigation into the incident had begun, but its path was anything but straightforward. The police department was in turmoil, with whispers of division growing louder. Tensions were high as the officers involved, Donovan, Harris, and Cole, were placed under scrutiny. The town, too, seemed to be holding its breath, caught between shock and anticipation. For Martin, these early days of the investigation were filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. He had faith that the truth would prevail, but he also knew how deeply rooted biases could cloud judgment. In the meantime, he continued to lead the sheriff's department, maintaining his focus on transparency and fairness. His calm demeanor was both admired and criticized. Some saw it as a sign of strength, while others viewed it as detachment. At the center of it all were the three officers, each coping with the fallout in different ways. His priority now was to implement new training programs that emphasized empathy, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. He worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served, encouraging open dialogue and trust-building initiatives. The town's response was mixed. Some residents welcomed the reforms, seeing them as overdue steps toward a fairer, more just system. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that the incident had been blown out of proportion, a narrative that had gained traction among a few vocal detractors. Martin met these challenges head-on, remaining calm and patient, but unwavering in his commitment to the cause. Amidst these developments, Martin's personal life was undergoing its own process of healing. Jordan, who had struggled with the emotional impact of the incident, was slowly beginning to understand his father's approach to justice. One evening, after a long day at school, Jordan approached Martin, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything that's happened," Jordan began hesitantly. "I still don't understand why you didn't fight back that night. But I think I'm starting to get it. A little." Martin looked at his son, his heart swelling with pride. He could see the growth in Jordan's eyes, a new layer of understanding that had emerged from the pain and confusion. "It wasn't about winning that moment, Jordan," Martin explained gently. "It was about setting an example, not just for you, but for the whole town. Sometimes fighting back isn't about force, it's about showing what true strength looks like." Jordan nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said quietly. "And I want to help. I want to be part of the change." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Jordan, inspired by Martin's unwavering commitment to justice, began volunteering at community outreach events, connecting with young people who shared similar experiences of bias and discrimination. For the first time, he felt a sense of agency, a belief that he could contribute to the solutions his father was working toward. Meanwhile, Gabrielle, who had been Martin's steadfast supporter throughout the ordeal, found herself grappling with mixed emotions. She was proud of her husband's resilience, but she also feared for his safety and the toll the fight for justice was taking on him. One night, as they sat together on the porch, she voiced her concerns. "Martin, I know you're doing what's right," she said, her voice filled with both love and exhaustion. "But I worry about you. I don't want you to lose yourself in this battle." Martin reached for Gabrielle's hand, his touch reassuring. "I know, Gabby," he replied softly. "But this isn't just a battle, it's a journey, and it's one we're all on together. I'm not doing this alone. I have you, Jordan, and the community behind me." Gabrielle smiled, a tear escaping down her cheek. "Just promise me that you'll take care of yourself, too," she urged. "We need you here, not just as our sheriff, but as a husband and father." Martin nodded, his eyes reflecting the depth of his gratitude and love. "I promise," he said, "and I'll make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else in this town." As the town continued to heal, there were moments of unexpected redemption. Officer Harris, who had taken a public stance of accountability, became an advocate for change within the police department. He worked closely with Martin to develop new training protocols and took part in community dialogues where he openly acknowledged his past mistakes. "I was part of the problem," Harris admitted during one of the meetings. "But now, I want to be part of the solution. I know it won't be easy, but I'm committed to earning back the trust I lost." His honesty and willingness to change were met with cautious acceptance from the community. It wasn't a complete redemption, but it was a start, a step toward rebuilding trust and understanding. Officer Cole, who had resigned after testifying against Donovan, found a new sense of purpose. He began working with local youth organizations, sharing his story as a lesson in integrity and accountability. He spoke candidly about his own failures, hoping to inspire others to make better choices than he had. "I made mistakes," Cole would tell the young people he mentored. "But what matters is how you move forward. You have the power to do what's right, even when it's hard." As for Donovan, the consequences of his actions were severe. With his career in law enforcement over, he struggled to find a new path. His dismissal was more than just the loss of a job. It was a public reckoning with his own behavior. For the first time, Donovan was forced to confront the biases and anger that had driven him. It was a harsh lesson in karma, a reminder that actions born from prejudice and aggression often lead to self-destruction. In a surprising turn, Donovan reached out to Martin months later, asking for a private meeting. When they met, Donovan's demeanor was vastly different. His once defiant expression was now marked by humility and regret. "I came here to apologize," Donovan said, his voice sincere. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I realize now how wrong I was. I let my biases control me, and I hurt you in this town." Martin looked at Donovan, seeing the weight of genuine remorse in his eyes. "It takes courage to admit that," Martin replied, "but words alone aren't enough. If you truly want to change, it has to be reflected in your actions from here on out." Donovan nodded, understanding the gravity of Martin's words. It was not a complete redemption, but it was a step in the right direction. A small but significant moment of accountability and potential growth. As the town gradually settled into a new normal, Martin found solace in the progress that had been made. He knew there was still much work to be done, but he felt a sense of fulfillment, a belief that the community was moving in the right direction. One early morning, as he and Gabrielle watched the sunrise from their porch, Martin felt a deep sense of peace. "Karma may be slow, but it's steady," Martin mused, his voice filled with hope, "and redemption is always possible." Gabrielle leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full of love and admiration. "Yes," she agreed, "and you've shown us all what that looks like." As the sun rose higher, the town awoke to a new day, one filled with the promise of a better, more just future. It was a future shaped by the courage to confront the past, the strength to seek redemption, and the resilience to keep moving forward. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.